Joseph and Daniel, two people that were separated by about 1,000 years. Um, did they have the same mission? The Bible repeats itself, but were they doing the same job? Let's find out. Let's come along. If you've seen in my other videos, I kind of hint at this, and in Hamas versus Israel, the video, I kind of go into it a little deeper, where I say there's certain roles that people have in the Bible, and it's people put in these roles, but it's the same kind of role throughout the movie of the Bible. So I want to talk about Daniel and Joseph, two people that are separated, but did they have the same role? Not the whole role, but part of the role. Wasn't it the same? So let's talk about Joseph. Joseph lived um, 600, years before Christ, which puts him about 2330 from creation. We know the story of Joseph. He was the 11th son of Israel, which was Jacob. Um, he was one of 13 children because they also had a girl, Dinah. Joseph, if we remember, Joseph was born to Rachel, which was the wife that Jacob loved the most. They were him, Rachel and Leah were both the daughters of Laban, if we remember him, which turns out to be Rebekah's brother. If we can remember that Jacob, because when Joseph was born, Jacob was older, so he loved he loved Joseph more and treated him above the other sons. So I want to just say that that's not always a good way to be, but we'll find out. And it turns out the other sons were jealous of him. He had a dream where he said the other brothers bowed to him, and that really infuriated the other brothers. And then he ended up, the brothers wanted to kill him, but they ended up selling him, and he ends up in Egypt. And a funny thing happens when he's in Egypt. He's thrown into prison, for, I don't want to tell the whole story of Joseph, but he's thrown into prison. And while he's in prison, there's a baker and a butler that come to him and they give him a dream. And they said three, they get both dreams were circled around three, which is a number of God. And Joseph interprets it. And then eventually in the future, Pharaoh had a dream and Joseph was called and he was brought before the Pharaoh and he identified the dream, which was seven uh, fat kine and then followed by seven skinny kine that ate him up. And Joseph interprets the dream to mean 7 good years and 7 bad years, followed by 7 bad years of famine. So Pharaoh is so happy, he puts him in charge of the grain to store it up for the bad time, if you remember the story. And then it turns out that, in the land where Jacob was with the other sons, the famine was very sore there. So they sent the 10 brothers, not all of them, to see if they can buy grain from Egypt. And it turns out that they come across Joseph, who's in charge of the grain. They didn't recognize him, but Joseph recognized them. And the whole story plays out, and he ends up doing a trial to find out about his brother Benjamin, because they were both born of the same parents, to see if the same thing happened to the other brother. So it turns out that at the end of this, he reveals himself, and Jacob and all his tribe of people came in to live in Israel. That's how they got stuck in Israel before the Exodus, stuck 400 years. But Joseph came to the realization that God had sent him all that happened. God had sent him ahead of time to prepare for the future so that he would be able to save Jacob and his brothers and keep the family going through hard times. And that's pretty much, the story that I want to take out of Joseph. There's more to it than that, but I just want to take that part out of it. And then next, we'll talk about Daniel. Now let's get into Daniel. Daniel lived about 600 years before Jesus came, which puts us with about 3,400 years from creation. Now, Daniel has a very similar story if we think about it logically. And this is where we're going to have to think about this. Daniel ended up in Babylon during, during the time when Nebuchadnezzar had taken Israel and carried them off. Now, Daniel was a special person because he was a true prophet. So this is going to come into this story a little bit. Now, Daniel was called to Nebuchadnezzar because he had a dream. And Nebuchadnezzar didn't understand the dream. And what had happened was he called on the wise men, very similar to what happened to Joseph. He calls on the wise men, the Chaldeans. Remember those two terms, the wise men and Chaldeans. He calls on the wise men to say, you know, tell me my dream and what does it mean? Because Nebuchadnezzar himself forgot the dream. He knew he had the dream, but he forgot it. So he needed it told. They couldn't do it. So he threatened to kill them. And they bring in Daniel. And of course, Daniel, now he interprets the dream and he tells Nebuchadnezzar what's going to happen. And that's the point we need to know about Daniel. Now, here's the interesting fact. Now, how does Daniel fit into the whole scheme of things? Well, if you fast forward 600 years to the coming of Christ, we know the wise men came from the east. They traveled westward to get to Bethlehem. But why would they know to come? Like, who told them to come? The obvious answer would be Daniel, because Daniel was one of the Chaldeans. He was ahead of them. He was a leader of them, of the wise men. So he could have told them from God exactly what to look for in the coming of Christ, because Daniel amassed wealth and Daniel had no offsprings. So Daniel would have been the source of the frankincense, myrrh, and gold that Jesus would have received. And he told them from God, had given him probably, I'm speculating here, but it's the only thing that makes sense to me, that at a certain time when the Messiah needs this money, you're to bring it. Because we remember the story, I think it's in Matthew 2:8. If we remember the story, the child, Jesus was a child. He wasn't a baby. If you remember my other video, he was a child. He'd be a little older than a year when the wise men came. So the wise men, at the direction probably of Daniel, which I suspect, came, gave him the money, because that night, what happens? Joseph has a dream. And what does God tell Joseph? Get the child out of here, because Herod had put an edict to kill all the newborns under 2 years old. So I think that's the connection. So he perpetuated the line the same way Joseph did. If you use David as the center, before David, Joseph saved the line. After David, Daniel saved the line. But they both played the same role. And I'm not saying that was Daniel's only role. It wasn't. He had a lot of roles. But that was one of them. And they match up perfectly. Now we know.